Good evening. Welcome to the University of Pennsylvania and the Positive Psychology Center's Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm James Pawelski, Director of Education and Senior Scholar at the Positive Psychology Center. Dr. Martin Seligman is the Zellerbach Family Professor of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania and the founding director of the Positive Psychology Center. It was his initiative when he was president of the American Psychological Association some dozen years ago that launched the field of positive psychology. And he continues to provide leadership to the field through his research, teaching, and application of positive psychology at the Positive Psychology Center. Dr. Seligman is the author of hundreds of journal articles and some 24 books with translations into more than 30 languages. He's just published his latest book called Flourish, A Visionary New Understanding of Happiness and Well-Being. And I'd like to invite Dr. Seligman to the podium now to say a few words of welcome.
Well, welcome to the third in our series of distinguished lectures. I want to say 120 seconds about what positive psychology is. Freud and Schopenhauer told us that the best that human beings could ever do was not to suffer and not to be miserable. Positive psychology says that that is a profoundly mistaken view of human possibilities, that any endeavor that is aimed only to go from -8 to -2, any endeavor that is solely remedial, the best we can ever get to is 0. But what positive psychology asks is, how do we go from +3 to +8 in life? Is mental health, is physical health, something real over and above the absence of illness? So positive psychology makes the claim, yes, there are substantive elements that are more than the absence of suffering and the absence of illness. Those include the presence of positive emotion, the presence of engagement, being totally absorbed in what you do, the presence of good relationships, the presence of meaning and purpose, and the presence of accomplishment. And merely not to suffer, not to be ill, guarantees none of those. And it's in that spirit that James Pawelski asked the question, who are the distinguished people from around the world that we can bring to put bones on the flesh of the elements of human possibilities? So with that, I want to reintroduce Dr. Pawelski to you to introduce today's speaker. James.
Thank you, Marty. The Positive Psychology Center's Distinguished Speaker Series explores connections between the humanities, the social sciences, and human flourishing. We're excited by the advances made by social science research into human flourishing, and we believe that to be most effective, these advances need to be more deeply informed by the various disciplines of the humanities. And we believe that these scientific advances can help open up new perspectives and possibilities for the humanities as well. To explore these connections further, I teach a course on the humanities and human flourishing in our Master of Applied Positive Psychology program, and we have started the speaker series. Previous speakers have included the philosopher Julia Annis speaking on the question, what does it mean to flourish? And the Harvard philosopher and psychologist Joshua Green talking to us about beyond point-and-shoot morality. We are pleased and honored to have a speaker with us this evening who is very distinguished indeed. In a world where it often seems that the only choice available is between dogmatic belief or dogmatic disbelief, Karen Armstrong has dedicated herself to exploring approaches to religion that transcend dogmatism. She is a TED Prize winner and a New York Times best-selling author, having written some 24 books, among them compelling biographies of the Apostle Paul, Muhammad, and the Buddha, insightful treatments of myth, fundamentalism, religious experience, and the role of women in religion, and 2 spellbinding autobiographies. Her most recent book is 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, which deals with the topic that will be central to her lecture tonight. Her lecture is titled Compassion, Nice Idea or Urgent Global Imperative. After her talk, we will have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Now, please join me in welcoming Karen Armstrong.
Thank you, James. Thank you all. Well, as you heard, in 2008, I won the TED Prize. And they give you some money, but more importantly, they give you a wish for a better world. And I knew almost immediately what it was I wanted to ask for. Because as a historian of world religion, it's long seemed to me very frustrating that the world religious traditions, which should be making a major impact on some of the chief tasks of our time, are in fact often seen, for obvious reasons, as part of the problem. One of the chief imperatives we have at the moment is surely to build a global community where people of all persuasions, all ideologies, all ethnicities can live together in mutual respect. And if we fail to achieve that, I fear we're not going to have a viable world to hand on to the next generation. We are in perilous times. On the one hand, our world has never been more closely knit than ever before. We've got, in business terms, in economic terms, when one market goes down, shares plummet all around the globe. We're joined together by the World Wide Web. Politically, what happens in Afghanistan or the Middle East today can have repercussions tomorrow in New York or London. We can no longer say that suffering is confined to distant parts of the globe. What happens in a place like Pakistan will have implications for us all. And yet our perceptions don't seem to have caught up with that reality. We're still acting very much as though we alone are the people that matter. Now, all the world religions have evolved their own version of what's often called the Golden Rule. Never treat others as you would not wish to be treated yourself. Sometimes put in a positive form, always treat others as you would wish to be treated. And they say that that is the test of faith. And yet, you very rarely hear about it. Very often when world leaders or people come together in the religious world, they're inveighing about a certain doctrinal point or about a particular sexual ethic, as though these things were the criteria of faith. And furthermore, the world faiths insist that you cannot confine your benevolence to your own group. You have to have what one of the Chinese sages called yan ai, concern for everybody. Honor the stranger, says Leviticus. Open your heart to the foreigner. Reach out, says the Quran, to all tribes and nations, and love your enemies, said Jesus. And it seems to me now that unless we learn to implement the Golden Rule globally, when we are failing the test of our time. We need to make sure that all nations, all peoples, whether we like them or not, are treated as we would wish to be treated ourselves. If we'd applied that ethic in bygone years, say when my country was colonizing major parts of the globe, if we'd applied that ethic, we might not be having so many problems today. It's now time to bring the compassionate voice of religion to the fore and make compassion a dynamic and energetic force in our dangerously polarized world. And it's no good waiting, it seems to me, for some prophet to waft in or for some pope to issue an edict. They haven't done so. It's up to us, to the people. And so when I accepted the TED Prize, I asked TED to help me to create and launch and propagate a charter for compassion. And the charter was put together, first of all, by hundreds and thousands of people online in a multilingual website. And we then presented these findings to a panel of about 20 leading activists and thinkers representing 20 of the major world religions. It was a sign, a demonstration, if you like, that at a time when the religions are nearly always seen to be at loggerheads, we can work together, despite our revealing and interesting differences. This we have in common. The Grand Mufti of Egypt came. We had Muslims. We had distinguished rabbis, Confucians, a Hindu and a Buddhist, and a whole slew of Christians. And the charter was finally launched. We wrote the charter. It's short, sharp, but it's essentially a call to action. This was never meant to be just a sort of feel-good exercise whereby at the end of the day we all had a nice warm glow and felt compassionate towards everybody. Somehow we had to find out how to translate this into practical, realistic, and sustained action. And, you know, at the start we thought, well, how on earth are we going to do this? But people stepped forward. And one of the things that I would never have thought of, for example, is becoming one of the leading movements in the Charter, and that is compassion in business. I have no head for business at all, but the people who've stepped up most energetically for the Charter have been businessmen, both here in the United States, in the Middle East, and in Pakistan. And we're having many thoughts about how to translate the compassionate element into business ethics. Planning a huge conference soon on compassion and money. We've seen what happens recently when greed and egotism jump into the way. We've seen it with the meltdown, where we head for a sort of hole, like that strange hole that I see in front of me, which seems to be separating me from my audience. Pakistan is becoming another leader of the Charter. I was there in early February, and the enthusiasm for the Charter was extraordinary. We're concentrating in business. My sponsor there's an extraordinary young businessman, and many of his colleagues are working together with the other teams internationally on the business project. But in education, we want to change the DNA of that country. And already in about 1,300 independent schools, we can't touch the public sector, which is in the control of the Wahhabi-style establishment. But in the 1,300 schools, colleges, and universities in the independent sector, we're introducing a curriculum of compassion at primary, secondary, and at university level. It will be compulsory to take a course in compassion. And we're just opening an office for the Charter in the Middle East. We've also got a cities program, gradually building up a network of compassionate cities. Last year, Seattle declared itself the first city of compassion. The mayor affirmed the Charter, and they're working on business ethics and environmental ethics. Two of them, the leading lights of the Compassionate Action Network, are here from Seattle, are here with us tonight. We can turn this thing around. People often say to me, well, you know, who wouldn't agree with your Charter? Everybody believes in compassion. Everybody believes in the Golden Rule. First of all, I don't care whether you believe in it or not. The question is, are you doing it? Are you behaving in a compassionate way all day and every day, as Confucius said? And if I had $1 for every single person who in the last couple of years has told me that they believe in compassion and the golden rule in that rather dismissive tone, then I would be able to fund the charter for at least a couple of years if they all gave me $1. So we can turn these things around. If the silent majority who believe in compassion got active, we can counter the voices of extremism and the strident voices of hatred that tend to dominate our news. But what is compassion? I think it's interesting that the word has fallen so far out of our lexicon that people don't seem to know what it means at all. We have, for example, when I was in Holland just a couple of years ago, I gave a lecture, and the text of my lecture was published in the main Dutch newspaper, translated into Dutch. And I specifically said that compassion did not mean feeling sorry for people. But every single time I said the word compassion, it was translated pity. People think it's just some kind of soppy, goodwill feeling, handing out of flowers, a sort of doolally, hippie, kumbaya emotion. Compassion is hard work. The first person, as far as I know, to formulate the golden rule was Confucius, who was asked by his disciples, "Master, which of your sayings can we put into practice all day and every day? And what is the central thread that runs through all your teaching?" And Confucius said, "Shu, likening to the self. Look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Never treat others as you would not like them to treat you." Now, notice that all day and every day. In England, have a habit of saying when we've done something nice for somebody, "Well, that's my good deed for the day." As though we can now return for the next 23 hours to our usual lives of unkindness, bitterness, and selfishness. No, all day and every day. Because, as Confucius said, what holds us back from our best selves is egotism, is self-bound, self-preoccupation. And we know that. What wakes us at 3 in the morning when we go round in a little rat run saying, "Why am I so unhappy? Why is life so unfairly pitted against me? Why has X got what I haven't got?" If we take ourselves out of that, our horizons expand. And people have found that when they've taken this compassionate ethic seriously, their horizons expand too. We have within our brains, and we have within we've got centers of compassion. We have hormones that make us compassionate. True, they're not as strong, these kind of drives, as the ones that are poised for self-defense or for territory or for sex, often called, I believe, by neuroscientists, the 4 Fs: fighting, fleeing, feeding, and reproduction. But nevertheless, it is a natural capacity within us to have altruism. It's what makes a mother mammal look after her young, instead of selfishly just leaving them as the turtles do. So all day and every day, people have found that it makes you just think of things from other people's perspective. Never treat others as you would not like them to treat you. Our word compassion comes from the Greek and Latin root kompathein, and it means to experience or endure something with another person, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And that's the dynamic of the golden rule, to try imaginatively to see what everybody what the other person is thinking, and what even your enemies are thinking. But that's not the only way that you can think about compassion. In the Buddhist and Sanskrit, karuna means to take positive action to separate people from their pain. It's to take responsibility for the pain of the world. And in the Arabic and Hebrew tradition, rahma, it is related etymologically to the word for womb. And that immediately raises the sort of image of mother love. Now, the icon of the mother and child is a sort of symbol of humanity, almost a universal symbol of humanity. And yet mother love is hard. A mother has to get up every night to her crying child, whether she feels like it or not, no matter how exhausted she is. She has to keep that child constantly in her sights all day and every day, aware of what he or she is doing at every single moment, ready to plunge in if he goes near a dangerous plug or something, or to protect it if the child is in danger. And then that cute little baby grows up and can become a horrible disappointment. But the mother doesn't give up, no matter how disillusioning the experience. The mother is usually there. And there's a very early Buddhist prayer that says, "Let us cherish all creatures as a mother her only child." And that is what the religions call us to do, to cherish all creatures, all species, and all human beings, however disappointing and disedifying they may be, as a mother cherishes her child, taking responsibility for every member of our race. And so compassion is something that is dynamic. And these sages who composed the Golden Rule, people like Confucius, the Buddha, the sages of the Upanishads, and later on the rabbis of the Talmud, Jesus, the Prophet Muhammad, they were all living in violent societies like our own, where aggression and warfare had reached a seemingly unprecedented crescendo. They were not sitting on pleasant little mountaintops or in desert fastnesses meditating. They were living in the heart of very, very turbulent times. Of course, the violence that they were facing was puny compared with what we're facing today. But they realized that human beings could not learn to live together unless they were able to consider others to be as important as they were themselves. And Confucius put it very clearly. He was asked by his disciples, how can you apply this to politics? And he said, well, it's perfectly simple. Use your own feelings as a guide to your treatment of others. You seek to establish yourself, then seek to establish others. You want to turn your merits to account, then make sure that everybody else in your vicinity, in your society, or in the country next door has the ability to turn their merits to account. Mozi, who came after him, said that if all the rulers of the world observed Yan Ai and observed the Golden Rule and had concern for everybody, nobody would invade anybody else's state, because they would not like that to happen to their own. And he began a movement in non-violence. Now, I have found such kind of confusion about compassion. People look at me baffled and say, well, how on earth do we start? So I wrote a book, as I've heard, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, and you'll recognize straight away the reference to Alcoholics Anonymous, because we are addicted to our prejudices and dislikes. I can see people looking mutinous sometimes. What can I never sound off about that annoying colleague? or my particular enemy in the office, or that annoying sibling. We feed on our likes and dislikes. They define us. We're dependent upon them. They define our sense of self. Very often the people we stigmatize as enemies are people who in some way represent everything that we fear that we might be and everything that we hope we are not. And when we utter a sort of a vicious remark about them, we can get a sort of buzz of righteousness and at our own brilliance and cleverness. Not dissimilar to the first drink of the evening, or in the days when I used to smoke, the first time I lit up a cigarette. But of course this poisons you. A cigarette does anyway, and poisons the atmosphere. And this addiction cannot just be given up wholesale. We have to do it step by step, integrating compassionate practices into our life, step by step, until they have a transformative effect. But the point is that it just won't stop you. This isn't just to stop you being nasty to people, though one hopes it will, but it will increase your capacity. It will make you bigger and better, because what hems us in is our preoccupation with self. Now, we have to be preoccupied with ourselves in order to survive. And it was because of this that we evolved, that our species survived, because we had this very strong tendency to leap away in times of trouble. Or if a lion suddenly leapt into the auditorium, we'd be supposed to leave this high-minded discussion and run for our lives. But we can also do something more than just stopping this. We can activate all those capacities for compassion within us and lose that self-preoccupation, lose that pettiness that cannot bear to say a nice word about another person because it seems somehow to impair us. My favorite experience of that was when someone rushed up and said, "Congratulations on your wonderful reviews," and then added, "Have you put on weight recently?" We often it's very difficult for us sometimes to praise wholeheartedly, very difficult for us to apologize wholeheartedly. We always like to say, make sure the other person knows that he or she was also at fault. This is petty. It is cutting us down to the limits of our own selfish, self-interested, self-preoccupation. Let it go and open your heart to the other. Now, if you do it all day and every day, as Confucius said, people find that they gain new capacities of mind and heart. They experience what has been called transcendence, or Ren, the Confucians called it, where just the experience of living a compassionate life all day and every day was transformative. It was itself the transcendence you seek. In the Eastern traditions, the spiritual life is often called the way, that people are not so concerned to define what lies at the end of the religious quest. The process itself of leaving that self-preoccupation behind is itself the transcendence you seek. A dancer does not walk onto a stage and turn a perfect pirouette. It takes years of practice, a great part of every day and all day, every day, nearly all day, before she masters the art. But if she masters that art, she turns a natural capacity to move and run and jump into something of unearthly grace that is utterly impossible for an untrained body. The same is true of an athlete, of a musician, a singer. Practice makes perfect, and we discover a whole new capacity, but you have to do it to get it. Now, I'm not going to plod through all 12 steps you'll be relieved to hear. I'm just going to focus on a couple of them. And one is the 7th step, which is entitled How Little We Know. Now, this is the age of information. We're used to getting information about a whole range of facts at the click of a mouse. You sort of type in God, and up comes a whole lot of websites. And we like to think we know about everything. Maybe it's not true here, but our airways in the UK are clogged with phone-ins, chat shows, where people are encouraged, rightly so, to have their opinions on a whole range of subjects, which they air with great enthusiasm. But often, if you happen to know something about the subject under discussion, it soon becomes clear that the amount of reliable information on which these views are based could be comfortably contained on the back of a small postcard. And yet, we are very omniscient in the way we speak about other people. Oh, we say, the trouble with her is. And, or, oh, well, she's always. As though in a single sentence we could sum up the complexity of another human being. I don't know about you, but I'm a constant mystery to myself. I'm constantly surprising myself, saying, now, why did I do that? People pay good money to go to psychiatrists to find out about how they function and how they work. And we not only do that with other human beings, we do it for whole cultures, based often on a half-remembered op-ed piece that we read 2 years ago, or an interview that we saw on television, which happened to chide with our own instinctive view. And this is all causing a great deal of trouble as we omnisciently discourse about other people. Now, Socrates, the founder of the Western rational tradition, had very little time for this. People who came to Socrates usually thought that they knew exactly what they were talking about. But after only half an hour of Socrates' relentless questioning, they found they didn't know the first thing about courage or justice or goodness. They found that the foundations on which they thought they were building their lives were very, very shaky indeed. No matter how stringently Socrates and his friends argued, something always eluded them. It seems to be something about our human experience that there's always something that exceeds our conceptual grasp. We used to think that science was going to answer all our questions. And Descartes rather sort of touchingly said, look at those lovely clouds. Soon there will be no need to feel awe or wonder about them. We'll be able to explain them. We'll be able to know everything about them. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was predicted very confidently there were about 15 outstanding problems in the Newtonian system, and then our knowledge of the universe would be complete. 20 years later, along comes Einstein, along comes quantum theory, and we have an indeterminate universe, which did not fill Einstein with frustration, but with awe. He said, to be in the presence of what is unknowable to us brings human beings the highest experience of their lives, that he to whom this emotion is unknown is as good as dead. Karl Popper used to say, we don't know anything. And he said that far from being a source of frustration, this was a source of immense contentment, to be continually pitting yourself against questions that are bigger than you, enlarges your mind, enlarges your horizon. Nobody could win a Socratic dialogue. It always ended with everybody realizing that they knew nothing at all. And at that moment, Socrates said, you've become a philosopher. Somebody who loves wisdom, but knows that they don't have it, but pursue it as ardently as a lover pursues his beloved. So at the end of his life, Socrates said, according to Plato, I am wise in only one respect, that I know nothing at all. Now, we like to praise Socrates and the Greek rational tradition, but we've rather lost that sense of omniscience. And as for other people, we've lost the sense of reverence that the religions, at their best, three little words that always have to be used in connection with religion, as with many other matters, that every single human being is divine, is a sacred mystery. The Hindus will bow in reverence when they encounter one another to acknowledge that they are encountering the sacred in that other person. Brahman, the reality that binds the world together, that is unspeakable, utterly mysterious. But Brahman is the all, so it can't be defined in any way. And yet, each one of us, the self, the Atman of each one of us, the deepest core of us, is Brahman. That was the immense discovery of the sages of the Upanishads. And I think that's the meaning of incarnation. Never mind, who Jesus was. God somehow became human, said St. Athanasius, who framed the doctrine of incarnation in order that humans become divine. In the Greek Orthodox Church, they don't believe that Christ died to save us from our sins. They believe that every single one of us has the capacity to be like Christ, even in this life. One of their favorite icons of Jesus is not Jesus suffering on a cross, agonized, that's a very Western view, but Jesus on Mount Tabor, where you remember the gospel story that his face shone, his garments go whiter than snow, and he's transfigured. The divinity within him shines through. He's the first fully human being who has allowed divinity to soak through him without pushing that sacredness away into, as most of us do, limiting it by our selfishness, by our small-mindedness, by our spite. And we can, if we work hard at it, say the Greek Orthodox, we can do that. We can become divine, even in this life. One of my favorite Muslim philosophers is the 12th, 13th century mystical philosopher Ibn Arabi. And he said that every single one of us is a revelation of one of God's hidden names. And that, of course, we can deface this name within ourselves, but we will only know that name that has been inscribed in us. And if we spoil that name, the world has been deprived of a unique and unrepeatable revelation of the divine to the world. And our task as human beings is to make that divinity within us an active, luminous force in the world for good, and to look beneath the unpromising exterior of those whom we meet and see that sacred spark and enable it, if it is in any way deemed diminished by circumstances of suffering or pain or impoverishment or injustice, to allow that divinity to shine forth. It's a mission. And yet so often we don't do this. We forget about the mystery. We discourse about each other and about whole cultures with this sort of awful know-all pseudo-knowledge. There's a little bit in Hamlet which has always struck my attention. Hamlet, you'll remember, was causing a great deal of trouble at the court of Denmark. And the king sets two spies on him, his old friends Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to report back. It doesn't take Hamlet long to realize what's going on, and One night he comes to Guildenstern and he presents him with a pipe. And he says, "I pray you, play upon this pipe." And Guildenstern says, "My lord, I cannot." "Oh, it's as easy as lying," says Hamlet caustically. Then, here I paraphrase a bit, he said, "It's simple. You just blow down this tube and wiggle your fingers around and out comes the music. Nothing to it." "My lord, I have not the skill," says Guildenstern. "Why, look you now," says Hamlet. "What a poor thing you would make of me. You would play upon me as upon this pipe. You would pull out all my stops. You would play me to the top of my bent. You would pluck out the heart of my mystery." Pluck out the heart of my mystery. How often we do that with others, by our belittling comments, by our belittling thoughts that are usually serving some interest, be it intellectual or political or in business of our own. To pluck out the heart of our mystery. And before I leave this step, I want to just finish this part of the lecture with a quotation from Ibn Arabi, whom I mentioned earlier. He was a Sufi, and it's quite common for a Sufi to cry in ecstasy that he's neither a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. He's at home equally in a synagogue, a mosque, a temple, or a church. Because once you've glimpsed the divine, the tension of these man-made divisions fall away. And what I'm saying, he's talking about religious appreciation of others. But it can apply to any of our firmly held opinions. Because the ancient Taoists used to say, the trouble is we interject our own egos into our opinions. And so when they're attacked in any way, we get defensive, we get aggressive, and feel personally assaulted. Let it go. This is too small. And open your mind to something bigger. And here's what he says. I discovered this early in my studies, and after my very dogmatic Catholic upbringing, it was extraordinary to me to read this. Do not praise your own faith so exclusively that you disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss much good. Nay, you will fail to recognize the real truth of the matter. God, the omniscient and omnipresent, cannot be confined to any one creed. For he says in the Quran, "Wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah." Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature. And in praising it, he praises himself, which he would not do if he were just. But his dislike is based on ignorance. For Ibn Arabi, ignorance, unlike the luminous grasp of unknowing, was the inability to see the divine in all others. Even that he used to say too that even our knowledge of that name that is inscribed in our hearts will be deeply influenced by the religious tradition into which we were born. My heart, he said once in a poem, is capable of every form, of a pagan's temple, of the holy tablets of the Torah, of the Quran. And that to see, not in a sort of sloppy way, but to open your heart to the wisdom that lies in every one of the great world traditions. Now, I'm going to fast forward now to step 12. This is the hardest. Love your enemies. Now, this needs a bit of decoding. We often love, I'm not comfortable with using the word love very much in terms of compassion because we've debased it so much, the term, haven't we? I love ice cream. Or I absolutely love a gin and tonic, and I love that movie. This compassion has very little to do with feeling. We're not asking people to be filled with soggy tenderness towards Osama bin Laden. Feelings come and go. They depend on the state of our digestion, how well we slept last night, on all kinds of, they come and go. Sometimes we can feel murderous anger towards our nearest and dearest. They're not important. It's so much noise. Love your enemies is, of course, a saying by Jesus. And Jesus is doing, it's in the Sermon on the Mount, when he's doing a bit of rabbinic midrash, taking a text of Scripture, of the Hebrew Scriptures, and then pushing it further, making it mean something new. This is what the rabbis were doing at the time St. Matthew's Gospel was being written. And Jesus is being shown to be himself a rabbi. And he quotes the golden rule that was enunciated by Hillel. Now, Jesus is quoting Leviticus. Love your neighbors. Love your neighbor as yourself, says Leviticus. And now Jesus is taking it that bit further and says, yes, love your neighbor, love also your enemy. It's pushing it out provocatively. Now, Leviticus is a legal text. It is not talking about emotion. Talking about feelings in Leviticus would be as out of place as it would be in a Supreme Court ruling. Love, hesed, is a term that was used frequently in international treaties. It's a legal term. It means loyalty. And two kings who might have been enemies promised to love each other, which didn't mean they would fall into each other's arms and become best friends, but that they would give each other practical help and advice, that they would come to their former enemy's aid in time of trouble, that they would look out for his best interests, even if this meant a sacrifice of their own short-term goals. And this is the kind of love that we must give even to those we consider enemies. Because had we done so earlier, the mess of hate that is in some few hearts, in some parts of the world, and resentment might not have been so intense. Well, love your enemies. I'm going back to the Greeks now. In the 5th century, when Athens was rising to the peak of her cultural fluorescence in the 5th century before Christ, the Greeks, the people of Athens, developed tragic drama. Every year on the Festival of Dionysus, god of transformation, the citizenry of Athens were obliged to attend plays, a series of trilogies put on by the leading tragedians. This as was a civic duty. Everybody had to come. It wasn't a question of, oh, have you caught the latest Euripides? People were let out of jail to come to these things because they represented a sort of civic communal meditation. The plays usually recast one of the ancient Greek myths and put it in a modern setting that spoke directly, very often, to a particular plight or a predicament that Athens was preoccupied with at that moment. And what they were doing was putting suffering on stage. Very often we want to push suffering away from us and say suffering has not much to do with us. We want to separate ourselves from suffering. But the Greeks would put a man or a woman in an extremity of pain, and then the leader of the chorus would turn to the audience and say, now, weep for Oedipus. a man who had broken every taboo in the book. Unknown to himself, he had killed his father and married his mother. Or Heracles, who was driven mad by a goddess and in his divine frenzy killed his wife and children. People that one would shun if one met in ordinary life. And now weep for Oedipus. And the Greeks did weep. They didn't just wipe an embarrassed tear from the corner of their eye and gulp. They wept aloud because they believed that weeping together created a bond between human beings. And when the Athenians saw these plays, they felt that they were not alone in their pain. They felt that we all suffer, and we all suffer often from trivial little things. We have very big suffering, but sometimes the things that make us suffer are so tiny and egotistic, we wouldn't want to mention this to anybody. But they learnt, we all suffer. This is the bond that we have with all human beings. Let that bond be felt, and it creates civic unity. Now, the first of these plays to have survived was Aeschylus's The Persians. It was put on about 7 years after the Battle of Salamis, in which the Greeks, the Athenian naval fleet, had inflicted a landmark victory on the Persians. But before they achieved that victory, the Persians had rampaged through Athens and trashed the city. They had looted, they'd pillaged, they'd stolen, burned, and then they went up to the Acropolis, the sacred hill outside the city, and smashed, destroyed all the beautiful new temples that had just been built. And now, Aeschylus is asking the Athenians weep for the Persians. There is not a shred of triumphalism, no gloating, no mission accomplished. The Persians are presented as a people in mourning. The people of Athens are being asked to consider the Battle of Salamis from the point of view of the defeated. At one point, we see that it's said that Athens and Persia are sister nations, equal in power and fair and majesty. Now, could we do this? Coming up to the anniversary of 9/11, put on a play in Broadway that looked at recent tragedies from the position of the people of Iraq or Afghanistan, and in such a way that we weep for them. And our hearts would be enlarged. And we would be greater people. And it's a tradition that goes back very much further than Aeschylus, right back to the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. And this is where I'm going to end. It's the Iliad, as you know, tells the story of one tiny incident in the long 10-year war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And Achilles, the chief warrior on the Greek side, has a quarrel with his king. And in a fit of egotistic pique, small-mindedly, he flounces off to his tent and sulks there, and withdraws all his men from the war. This is catastrophic for the Greeks. And in the ensuing confusion, Patroclus, Achilles' beloved friend, is killed by Hector, one of the Trojan princes. And Achilles goes mad with rage and grief. He's normally a tender-hearted man, but he absolutely loses his humanity. Even the gods are horrified. He challenges Hector to a duel, and the two of them fight it out in front of both of the armies. and in front of the royal family, Hector's family, who watch from the city walls of Troy. And Achilles kills Hector. And he then mutilates the body in front of the family, in front of all the Trojans. He takes his body and ties it behind his war chariot and drives it round and round Patroclus' grave. And then he does a terrible thing. He refuses to give the body back to the family for burial. And in Greek terms, that means that Patroclus' soul will never know rest. It will be restless and wandering, homeless, sorrowful for all eternity. But then one night, into the Greek camp comes old King Priam of Troy, Hector's father, and he's in disguise. He makes his way towards Achilles' tent, and then he takes off his disguise, and of course everybody is absolutely shocked. The old man coming into enemy territory to plead for the body of his son. And he falls falls down before Achilles and embraces his knees and weeps. And Achilles looks at the old man, and he remembers his own father. And he too begins to weep. And the two men weep aloud together, each for their own pain. Priam weeps not only for Hector, but for all the other sons that Achilles has slain. At this point, Homer calls him man-slaughtering Achilles. And Achilles weeps, Homer says, now for his father, and now for Patroclus. And then they've created that bond between them. The weeping stops, and the two men look at each other. And then Achilles goes and gets Patroclus' body and brings it to the father, lays it in the old man's arms, very tenderly, worried that the weight of this will be too much for the old man. And then the two men look at each other, and there is a numinous silence, and each sees the other as sacred, as divine, as godlike. And that is when we learn enough to transcend that inhibiting ego, self-bound ego, to realize that our enemies also have pain and can weep for their pain as well as for our own. At that moment, we have become divine ourselves. We have become godlike and have, in a sense, fulfilled our humanity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karin. It was delightful to listen to those words. I think we could have just kept going for another hour or two. Maybe we could have gone through all 12 of those. We have some time for questions, and we have 2 microphones here in either aisle. So if you will begin to come, I'll begin as people are coming to the microphones, Karin, with my own question. I really like what you said about the different religions having a different perspective on God or Allah, the being and so forth, that no one particular religion has the only or correct way of seeing things. And I wonder if you could tell us something about your thoughts about how we can overcome the divisions that are so rampant in our culture. And I'm not just talking about divisions of belief, because those are certainly there and they're somewhat apparent, but not just how can I learn about religions that I didn't grow up in, but how can I feel them? I'm guessing this is part of what the Charter for Compassion is about, so that it becomes something experiential and not simply cerebral.
Well, we're bound to have different ideas about God because God is indescribable. God goes beyond anything we can think and know. No one can have the last word. Allahu Akbar, God is always greater than we can conceive. And of course, we quarrel about these beliefs because as we interject our own egos into them, we identify our own little sense of what God is. A lot of our, as Ibn Arabi said, a lot of our dislike of these other faiths is based not on knowledge, but on ignorance. And so the more we can learn about others, but in an empathic way, the better. I don't think dialogue is much help always. It would be wonderful if dialogue in our society was conducted in a Socratic manner. This is step 8. How should we speak to one another? Our dialogue in our societies is often about winning in politics, in the media, in academia. It's not enough for us to seek the truth. We also have to defeat and humiliate our opponents. And very often a dialogue means bludgeoning someone else to accept our point of view. Convert to my faith. Leave people in there. But dialogue, you enter into it, it will only come, understanding will only come if you yourselves are prepared to be changed by it. Prepared to be changed by the encounter with the other. That doesn't mean you throw up all your own special beliefs and practices and your own loyalty to your religion, but your minds expand. You have a larger frame of reference. Your heart has expanded. You've let go some of those tight little I don't know what to call them, fetters we put on the way that we think about other people and other cultures. We think about them, and if they are in any way to be praised, that is going to not make us not look so good. After 9/11, I was giving a lot of talks and running courses, often entitled things like Understanding Islam. And I often thought, in a predominantly Christian world, I should be running alongside it another course called Understanding Christianity, because people often seem to attribute to Islam all the things that they felt were absolutely missing in their own society, own tradition, seeming to ignore the inquisitions, persecutions in their own tradition. We've all got awful things, all the traditions, we've all done them because we're wretched people, we're all flawed. Every single one of us is flawed. And sometimes people think, we can't be compassionate because, I've got this nasty little things that we're sort of, we wouldn't tell anybody. I'm not talking about great, interesting sins. I'm talking about those nasty little pettinesses that, we really won't want to share even with our nearest and dearest. And compassion is not for me. This large-heartedness, not for me. And we're all flawed. We all mess up. I think I think one of the problems is we don't know enough history. We don't, even our own history. We've seen a sort of roseate glow of it, perhaps, going back only so far. We need to know about one another's history. We need also, I think, a training in the humanities, which help you to experience the other. What is a novel? When you read a novel, but you're living another life and entering another world and getting practice in extending yourself out of your own limited, time-bound and personal experience. And so we need, and because so much of our culture is sort of about boosting our nation, boosting our culture, often at the expense of others, and sort of, doing great things in science and all that. This is all important. But the humanities also help to cultivate that other side, which makes us realize how mysterious everything is and that we don't know everything. So I think one of the things that helps is working together. And that's, what the Charter is trying to do, because here I am working with Pakistanis, with people who don't have any religion at all much. And here we all are working together. And when C.S. Lewis is not a theologian I quote very often. It's a bit too English for me. But nevertheless, he did say something that arrested me when I was at school. It's in his book, The Four Loves, and he's contrasting the love of Eros, when in erotic love two people gaze entranced into each other's eyes and want to sort of merge with one another, with friendship, where two people are standing side by side looking at a common goal. Now, we don't have to fall in love with one another or merge with one another, but we can be friends, standing side by side, bringing out what is in the best of all our traditions and making it speak to society to save our world together. This we can do. And in the process of working together, you discover commonality, and some of those barriers fall down.
Let's start with this.
Thank you. I simply wonder whether you must exercise your compassion to hear somebody's question before you answer that very question. My question is about authenticity. Authenticity. Some people talk about happiness, and some people roll up their sleeves and talk about authentic happiness, achievable by an individual. They talk about authentic religion. And they talk about authentic compassion. That was implied in the question, how about the feeling? Feeling being a very, very, very fast way of thinking. I wonder what you think about the authenticity of compassion for an individual that doesn't say much except that on a good day he says, I am.
Compassion for an individual who simply on a good day says, I am, and says very little. Oh, for such a man, I would have admiration rather than compassion. To say little, I often wish I could say less myself. My life in preference would be based in silence. I live alone, and I live a very solitary life. Who says very little, but who on a good day can take his existence, or perhaps a woman can do this too, take her existence into her hands and say, I exist, and think that through. Here we have what is in common to us all if we could just appreciate it, and it is being. The immense privilege of being, shared by all of us, every single creature on the planet, that we exist where we might not have existed. And compassion, therefore, for such a person means that that person has perhaps experienced that bond of being that unites us all, that is sacred, sacred in each one of us. right at the heart. This is the nub of us, being. It is a mystery. God is being itself. I am what I am, is what God is supposed to have said to Moses. I am, God is being itself. Esse se ipsum, says Aquinas. And the rest of us can only participate in that being to a greater or a lesser extent. But it is what we have in common. And it is that sort of sacred being that we must recognize in the other. And recognize it, honor it, and revere it. And know we have it in common, and protect it at all costs.
Thank you for your talk. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the positive golden rule, where we treat others as we would like to be treated. And I was wondering if you could speak to the dangers of compassion when people think that they're being compassionate as they use force or violence to compel people to do positive values.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm thinking of, for example, Muslim police who beat Muslim women under Sharia law because they're being immoral by not wearing a burqa.
Well, and there are many other examples of that kind of thing. I mean, we have it even, where people, Christians go around trying to convert people to their way of life, saying that they would like that done to themselves. They would like that. This is why we need both versions of the Golden Rule. That's why they sort of dovetail together as a reminder. Because yes, you can be, you can even, you chose an ugly example, but you can even be a real do-gooder and really do good in the, good in the world. And then in an untoward moment, say something vile or unfair or unrepresentative about another colleague or another people or another faith tradition, and take that, and make that kind of remark, so that, then that's not compassion. Compassion, it's not easy. Racing in and giving people democracy, for example, with the gun is not always, we might think it's a good thing, but is it? Would we like that done to ourselves? It's very difficult to be compassionate. It's not just a question of racing out, and you've got to look at that human being in his or her uniqueness and say, what can I do here to enhance his or her life? What is the best thing I can do? That requires huge intelligence, imagination, and never a single rule where you do it all the time. It requires, as Confucius said, every time is a different time, and you have to take the whole picture into account. So you need both versions of the Golden Rule, I think. I always prefer to use myself the second one. That's the Jewish and the Confucian one. But it works out, actually. I said this once to a Jewish scholar who introduced me to the Golden Rule. With a great story of Rabbi Hillel, who had asked by a pagan, would he convert. He said, the pagan promised he'd convert to Judaism if Hillel could recite the whole of Jewish teaching while he stood on one leg. And Hillel said, that which is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. That is Torah, and everything else is only commentary. Go and study it. An audacious and provocative remark. And I said, well, we've got, in Christian tradition, we say do to others, always treat others. And Chaim said, well, it all comes to the same thing, because, you treat others as you would like to be treated. Would you like somebody to come along and beat you or come along and trash your sacred traditions? No, then don't do it to others. So I think it works out to the same, but you're very right to point out that a too wholehearted adherence to the positive needs sometimes to refrain from doing harm is also important. To hold yourself back from making that unkind remark, from uttering that mean joke, from making that impatient gesture, and perhaps ruining somebody's day or just souring the world somehow. That both sides we need. Thank you.
Thank you.
I spend a great deal of time on the internet, as I think a lot of people in my generation do. And when you go online and you look through the comments, say you go to YouTube and you go through the comments, you can see how terrible people can be to one another, and they will anonymously say awful things. And I wonder if this is because we don't have a face-to-face, we're not in a one-on-one interface. We're allowed to be terrible because we don't see one another.
I think that's, thank you, I think that's very interesting. I think something's gone wrong with that mic somehow. It seemed to have pinged. We did hear you okay. Did everybody hear that? Yeah. I used to write a lot of articles in the Guardian newspaper, especially in the build-up to the Iraq War, putting various points of view. And the comments that I got were so appalling, online, that I felt things were worse than if I'd never written the article in the first place. It seemed to bring out, death threats and people threatening to burn down my house, and actually repeating the worst kind of sort of abuse. I think this is dangerous. And there are sad occasions, I think, of young people, perhaps younger than you, school children or high school children being bullied online, and this leading to suicide even. Yes, I think it's cowardly in a way. It's cowardly, as you say, because you don't see the person, there'll be no reprisals. And yet there is a desire to wound. And those wounds do stay in people's minds. And they fester. Perhaps long after that person has finished typing and forgotten all about this remark, that remains a splinter of ice in the person to whom it was directed. We do great harm. So I don't spend a great deal of time on the internet because I'm just too old for that. I've come to it too late, and I'll never feel quite at home in it. And it's wonderful in many ways. It's helping, the internet and everything, and is helping us to connect. But it can, like anything, out the worst. And it might be good sometimes to think would I say this if I were actually looking at the person in the eye and risking myself much more than when I'm safely typing in my own home, not depersonalizing a relationship. I'm reluctant to comment too much on the internet, because sometimes I think people seem to spend more time, than they do speaking to one another face to face. We were at a reunion, actually for anniversary for the Charter in the UN, and there were a whole bunch of people, on their Blackberries, sitting in a row. And my friend Joan Brown Campbell, who's even older than me, said, "Want to talk to some real people for a change?" And, everybody laughed. But we can get so worked up in keeping up with our emails and, Facebook, and instead of going out and meeting a friend. It's strange. It reminds me of Aldous Huxley, Brave New World, where he imagined us sitting in rooms and communicating by machines. So there is a danger of losing that, the impact, perhaps, of that mystery, the mystery of I am or I exist, the mystery of the vulnerability of another person, the mystery, the otherness of that other. that we should be thinking of when we can just reduce him or her to a cipher or to a name. That's an important, thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. Talked a lot about compassion towards other people. And I was wondering to what extent, and if so how, our treatment of the environment would be included in what you've said about compassion.
Yeah, is that your question? Yeah, thank you. You sound as if you come from the UK.
Yeah, I do.
Yes, I think I've concentrated on people because sometimes it's easier to feel compassion for some beautiful species than it is about our less beautiful members of our species. But the environment is crucial. And compassion means, the Buddhists are very good on this, that you cherish all creatures. And you, as a mother, her only child, that's not just human beings. You seek to preserve them from suffering, preserve them from in life, and don't see the mystery of the universe on which we are utterly dependent. We are interdependent in a way that we've never been before, but we now realize how utterly dependent we are, every single, on innumerable species, some of whom we don't even know about. And we've got used to just plucking out the heart of the mystery of the universe by exploiting it and using it for our own ends, or to make money, or to get rich, you know all about that. But I did want to concentrate on people, but we are in touch, say, with the Earth Charter. And indeed, one of the chief proponents, Rabbi Sotendorp, who is one of the people who helped to create the Earth Charter, was a member of our council who wrote our charter. And, you know, there is a partnership between the two. Sisters, I think, with a different focus. When I went to speak at the Earth Charter last year, somebody came up and said, you know, it was really nice to hear something about humans. So I think here you have a sort of dovetailing thing. We need to keep both in mind, but thank you for that. Thank you for your point.
Thank you.
Thanks, a very cogent, articulate talk. I want to bring up a problem I have with compassion. Now, it's a good thing, of course, to treat others how you would like to be treated as the golden rule. But one of the things I found in my experience, you know, just around talk about compassion, around people trying to be compassionate, whether to other people or to the environment, as the previous questioner asked, or to even to animals, is that what often becomes is people trying to feel good more about themselves, and what they end up doing is when they say they do maybe one good thing and they feel, oh, I'm a compassionate person now. But one of the things I found is people aren't really willing to change themselves or their own behaviors, and they make compassion more of a show. And that's sort of the problem I have with compassion, is that it's more of a feel-good, touchy-feely thing, which you touched upon at the beginning. But I think focusing on compassion shouldn't really be compassion shouldn't be the focus. It should be more of a justice or morality that should be the focus, and that would act as an umbrella to compassion, because it would be immoral to treat someone how you wouldn't want to be treated. So I was curious what you would say to that.
Certainly, self creeps in even to the most selfless act, as we look back and look on and admire ourselves. But really, you know, I think if you look at the book, here's a little advert for the book, you'll find that this begins with yourself, and it begins with compassion for yourself. That's step 3, rather. When you start realizing your frailty, because we are all frail beings. And as you start to practice compassion all day and every day, not just doing one good, feel-good sort of little action a day and then basking in that for the rest of the day, but all day and every day, you realize how often you fall down. by watching yourself go through the day, you begin to notice, oh, there I was again. This morning, for example, I sort of lost it this morning when poor James, I got off the train upset and I was cross. And I wanted, I couldn't get into my hotel room and had a horrible experience up at the so-called penthouse of my hotel, which is more like a sort of hellhole, frankly. And I came down, thinking, this is, oh God, I was sweating. There was no air conditioning up there, and I had to unpack my suitcase, change in a corridor, and then come down. I was flaming mad. Compassion wasn't in it, and then so we all lose it. And once you become aware, I think, of how frail we are, it's very difficult to just be endlessly feeling good about yourself. Because if you are, you're pretty myopic. I know how much I need to be compassionate because I used to be even worse than I was this morning. People used to say to me, Karen, I'd really hate to be your enemy. You never say anything nice about it. But that was because I was in such a bad state. I was miserable, I was ill, I was unhappy, frightened, a failure. And when you're in that beleaguered position, you start hitting out. But that person is still there in me. And I have to sort of struggle with it every day. And compassion means waking up and just noticing how unaware we are of other people a lot of the time. Not in any castigatory way. It's not to make you're not supposed to feel guilty about it. You apologize and just say, "Here, there I go again," and give a wry smile, because we're ridiculous beings, really. In many ways, we're not great sinners, we're ridiculous, but just to become aware of what you are. That's what the Buddhists say you must do with mindfulness, is to become aware of all these idiosyncrasies and limitations in order to work for something better. You become aware of your failings in order, just as an equestrian, but gets to know the horse she is training. Intimately, anticipate its every move, develop an intimacy with it so she can work with that horse and bring out its full potential. And unless we acknowledge these sort of deep flaws we all have, we can't have compassion for other people. We can be hard with other people if we think we're perfect. So I think that when just trying to live compassionately all day and every day brings you up against the limits of your own compassion. It makes you see how self-centered you are to the best of your endeavor. Even some of the great sages of compassion of our own time, people like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, had flaws. And yet, look what they achieved. And selfishness comes into everything we do. Just because you get a feel-good feeling, don't say, "Oh, there I go again." Something good may have come of it. Something good may still have come of any action. Keep going on. And realizing your flaws, picking yourself up gently and starting again. It's the only way. I'm not interested in feel good. And really, when you look at the state of the world, and you look at the state of your own personal apathy about the state of the world, there's very little to feel good about oneself in that respect.
2 comments. One, I hear you talking a lot about awareness, but I find that compassion for me is born by awareness, but of my heart, my own experience in life and my own pain. And then compassion is naturally born from that. And second, in reference to the question about triumphalism, I wanted to offer you another model, which perhaps you already know, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi speaks a lot about an organismic model of the world religions and peoples, that each has something special and unique to contribute, just as our lungs do one thing and our liver does something else. Each of the peoples in the world and each religion has something unique to contribute to the well-functioning of the world as a whole.
That's beautiful, thank you. I like that very much. I wasn't aware of it, but I shall look that up, thank you. And it's not dissimilar to Ibn Arabi's vision, that each one of the religions, each individual has something unique and unrepeatable to give to the world. And that's the riches of it, the riches of the 20th century, which enable us to know about each other in this way and learn and recognize those particular contributions. That is a gift that we have. And I quite agree that the Golden Rule is born precisely of becoming aware of one's own pain, one's own vulnerabilities, one's own heart experience. It's by looking into your own heart, as I said, and realizing what gives you pain, and then making a principled effort not to inflict such pain on anybody else. That's how we learn to grow, I think. That's what that version of the Golden Rule is trying to say. So yes, it is born of awareness, and with the heart, but you don't always feel it. It's not always a sort of a warm, effective thing, because sometimes the last thing you want you feel like is compassionate, and yet often you just don't know when you can change your life around by making that kind word or that kind effort, whatever you're feeling.
I think we have time for one final question.
Great, thank you. I just have a question about how the Golden Rule works when you're balancing rights. I'm a lawyer, so I love the fact that love your neighbour is a legal term. I hadn't realised that, thank you. I'm just thinking, for example, of Sarkozy's burqa ban at the moment. So on the one hand, we have, you could analyse it saying, well, you don't want to inflict this rule on the women because it makes them feel like they can't follow their religion, so we shouldn't inflict the ban on them from that point of view. But it's also been justified from a national security point of view. We can also see that it has a purpose in reducing potential suffering if there is a bomb in Paris. So how do we balance the Golden Rule in that kind of a framework?
That is precisely the difficulty of it.
Okay.
It's not easy. It's not just a question of, just be nice, or it requires real serious thought by, as I think I said at one point, taking the whole into a point of view. And trying to balance that is the essence, and the difficulties of finding that balance and finding what is the right thing to do here, with bearing all these in mind. That certainly applies in the legal world, and it should also apply in our dealings with ordinary people on a less legal level, I think. Here I am doing X for this, or saying X, and yet how will this affect the larger picture? Larger than just an interaction between two people. Yeah, thank you. There's no answer to that. I wish I could tell you there's a quick formula, but that's what Confucius meant. I love Confucius, as you may have gathered. He was a great discovery for me when I was writing my book, The Great Transformation, because he's so normal. He liked a good dinner, he liked a good song, and he felt that we could only complete ourselves with other people, like Socrates. We needed other people to complete us. We did that by being compassionate, so you need someone to interact with in that way. And he's always making this point that there's no one set rule for everything. It's not a rule in that sense. It's a principle that you then have to rack your brains and intelligence and creativity, driving it to the utmost to say, now here, what do we do for the best? And the perplexity of perplexity and complexity of our experience is that this is very difficult. Good and evil are so often mixed. I think that's the meaning of the Genesis story.
Thank you very much for those questions, and Karin, for your insightful responses. I'd like to thank briefly all of those who worked hard to make this evening possible, in particular the Positive Psychology Center's Distinguished Speaker Series Committee, including Karen Rockhind and Peggy Kern and Young Kim. So thank you to those of you. I would also like to inform you that a videotape was made of tonight's lecture, and that videotape, along with videotapes of the previous 2 lectures in the series, will be made available on the Positive Psychology Center's website at www.positivepsychology.org. We also encourage you to check that website over the summer, positivepsychology.org, as we will be posting information for our Distinguished Speakers Series for next year. So once again, thank you for coming. Thank you for Karin Armstrong's speech to us and her challenge and her words, and have a great night.